She was already bleeding when they found her, not from fear, not from carelessness, from a choice she had made 47 minutes earlier in the dark alone with a piece of metal in her left shoulder and a man dying in her arms. She had made the calculation the way her father taught her quietly, completely, without hesitation. The math was simple. His life or her comfort. She had already decided. Her right hand pressed combat gauze hard against the wound in the soldier's chest. Her left arm hung at a wrong angle, the sleeve of her uniform soaked through the fabric, turned the deep burgundy that medics learn to recognize before they learn almost anything else. She did not look at her own shoulder. There was no point looking at something you had already accepted. The helicopter was coming. She could hear it, the distinctive thud of rotor blades cutting through the Afghan night, still 2 minutes out, maybe 3. Around her, the compound had gone quiet in the way battlefields go quiet after everything terrible has already happened. The smell of cordite and dust hung in the air like something permanent, like it had always been there and always would be. The soldier beneath her hands was 22 years old. She knew that because she had read every file before they left the wire. She made it a habit. Know their blood types, know their allergies, know their ages, know their names. Because when it is 3 in the morning and a man is staring up at you with that particular look, the look that asks whether this is where it ends, you need to be able to say his name. You need him to know that someone in this darkness knows exactly who he is. She said it now, quietly, steadily. Stay with me, that's an order. She had not slept in 29 hours. She had not eaten since morning. Her body was performing a muted, insistent screaming that she had learned over years to set aside the way you set aside an alarm clock when you already know you have to get up. She breathed in. She breathed out. She kept both hands where they needed to be. The helicopter grew louder. 72 hours earlier, none of this had happened yet. 72 hours earlier, she was still just the medic who shouldn't have been there. FOB Kestrel had sat in the Kunar Valley of northeastern Afghanistan like something the mountains had reluctantly agreed to tolerate. The forward operating base was a collection of HESCO barriers, plywood structures, and prefabricated containers arranged in the methodical, unglamorous way of a place that prioritized function over everything else. The perimeter walls were stained by 2 years of weather in the particular kind of dust that exists nowhere on Earth except here, pale, fine, pervasive, the kind that gets into everything, including thoughts you thought were private. The mountains surrounded the valley on 3 sides. White-gray limestone ridges that rose at angles no civilian architect would permit, scarred by erosion and by something older and more patient than erosion. In the mornings, the peaks caught the sun before anything below them did, and for a few minutes each day, the high rock glowed orange against a sky that had not yet decided what color it intended to be. It was beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are. The CH-47 Chinook came in low and fast the way transport helicopters do when the people flying them have learned not to be a stationary target any longer than necessary. It touched down in a cloud of pale dust that reduced visibility to nothing. Equipment crates, supply boxes, and 3 replacement personnel stepped off the ramp in rapid succession. The last one off was Maya Reeves. She was 26 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, and weighed 118 pounds. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly beneath her cover. Her uniform was pressed despite the 14-hour journey that had preceded this moment. She wore the caduceus insignia of a Navy hospital corpsman on her collar and carried a medical ruck on her back that weighed 65 pounds, more than half her own body weight, with the ease of someone who had been carrying heavy things for a long time. She stepped off the ramp and immediately looked up. Not at the FOB, at the ridgeline. She stood there for 4 seconds, studying the high ground the way people study things they want to understand before those things understand them. Then she looked back down, adjusted the strap on her left shoulder, and walked toward the operations center without speaking to anyone. Staff Sergeant Cole Briggs was sitting on an ammunition crate outside the motor pool when she passed. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the settled confidence of a man who had survived several things that should have killed him. He watched her walk past with the easy appraisal of someone who had been in this part of the world long enough to have opinions about who belonged here. He looked at the medic who had just stepped off the Chinook. He looked at the man sitting next to him. Someone put the wrong person on the wrong bird. Lance Corporal Cody Marsh, 21 years old and 4 months into his first deployment, started to respond. But Gunnery Sergeant Wade Olson appeared from around the corner of the motor pool at that exact moment, and something in Olson's expression suggested that whatever Marsh was about to say should probably stay unsaid. Olson watched Maya Reeves walk toward the operations center. His face gave away almost nothing, but his eyes tracked her with the attention of a man who has learned to notice things before he has decided what to think about them. Olson had been in the Marine Corps for 22 years. He had served in Iraq twice, in Afghanistan 3 times. He had developed over those years an instinct for categorizing people within the first few minutes of observing them, not by rank or gender or background, but by something in the way a person moved and looked and carried themselves that told him whether they understood the world he operated in. Most people didn't. Occasionally someone did. He went back to what he was doing. But the tracking in his eyes continued for a moment after she had disappeared from view. Inside the medical station, Maya set down her ruck and looked at the room she had inherited. The previous corpsman had organized the supplies in alphabetical order. Maya stood in the doorway for 30 seconds, reading the arrangement the way a mechanic reads an engine, not for what was there, but for what it revealed about the mind that had created it. Alphabetical order was logical. It was also, in a tactical context, useless. When a man is bleeding out, no one reaches for bandages and thinks B. They reach for what their hands know is there because their hands have practiced reaching for it in the correct sequence, in the correct order of urgency in the dark under pressure, without thought. She spent the next 2 hours reorganizing everything. When she finished, the station looked different, less tidy perhaps to an outside eye. But every item of critical equipment occupied exactly the position it would need to occupy when seconds were the currency being spent. Tourniquets within reach of either hand without looking. Chest seals grouped by type. Hemostatic gauze in the outer pocket, not the inner. Nasopharyngeal airways accessible without opening a secondary container. She was running through the inventory a final time when Captain Doyle Mercer appeared in the doorway. He was 47 years old, lean in the way of people who forget to eat, when thinking hard with gray at his temples and the careful evaluating eyes of a man who had made decisions under pressure long enough that it had become simply the way he made decisions. He looked at what she had done to the medical station. He looked at her. He needed more information first. Settling in Corpsman Reeves, she answered without turning around. Almost finished, sir. He stayed in the doorway for another few seconds. Then he left. He had noted the reorganization. He had noted that she had moved things in ways that made sense if you knew what combat looked like from close up. He filed it without conclusion and walked back toward the operations center. The first test came on the third day. It was mid-morning already, 94 degrees, and a training exercise was underway in the southern portion of the FOB compound. A team of 8 men was running a rehearsal for a compound entry, drill repetitive physical unglamorous work performed in full kit under a sun that did not care about anyone's schedule. Maya was running her morning checks on the medical station when she heard something in the cadence of the men's movement that changed slightly, the kind of change most people would not hear. She heard it. She stepped out. Private First Class Howell was walking in an unsteady line between the staging area and the water point, concentrating very hard on the act of walking, which is usually a sign that walking is requiring more concentration than it should. His face was the color of someone whose internal systems were beginning to make executive decisions his conscious mind was not yet aware of. Maya crossed to him in 20 seconds. She did not ask how he was feeling. She put 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist and counted for 15 seconds while simultaneously reading his eyes, his skin color, and the coordination of his movement. Then she put her other hand against the back of his neck. She looked at Briggs. Get him inside. Core temperature above 104. If we don't drop it in the next 10 minutes, he goes into convulsions. Briggs looked at Howell. Howell did objectively look like a man, considering sitting down on the ground, regardless of whether the ground wanted him. Briggs picked him up under one arm and moved. Inside, Maya worked with the focused economy of someone who has run this sequence before. Ice packs to the neck, armpits, and groin. Oral hydration where he could tolerate it. Oxygen flow. Temperature checks every 90 seconds. She talked to Howell throughout in the flat, steady tone of someone who finds calm useful and has therefore made it a permanent occupant of their voice. By the time the second temperature check came back 101.3 and declining, Howell's eyes had cleared and he was capable of coherent sentences. Briggs stood near the back of the station watching. He had the expression of a man revising a calculation he had not known he was performing. He went back outside without saying anything. But he walked slightly differently than he had walked in, and Olson standing near the entrance noticed. Later that evening, Olson found Briggs cleaning his rifle near the wire. He sat down without being invited. A silence of the comfortable kind passed between them. She knew before he did, Olson said. Briggs kept his attention on the rifle. Could be training, Briggs said. Olson said nothing else. The second test came that night without warning, the way second tests always do. A vehicle returning from a resupply run struck a section of uneven ground at speed. The impact was not catastrophic by the standards of this part of the world, But Lance Corporal Denton Greer had been positioned at an angle when the vehicle lurched and the compression had done something significant to his chest. By the time they got him to the medical station, Greer was breathing in the rapid, shallow, increasingly desperate way that indicates the body is working extremely hard to accomplish something it is failing to accomplish. His trachea had deviated slightly to the left. His breath sounds on the right side were absent. Maya was in the station when they brought him in on her feet before the men carrying him had finished explaining what happened. She didn't need them to finish. Tension pneumothorax. She was already moving. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space. Hold him still. What followed happened in something very close to darkness. The station's primary lighting had not yet been switched on. She worked by touch and position and the coordinates of a human body she had studied until they were as familiar as the geography of her own hands. The needle found its mark. The sound that followed air escaping where it had been trapped was one of the more reliable sounds in trauma medicine. Greer's breathing immediately changed, shallower to deeper, faster to slower, the shift of a man coming back from a place he had been very close to not returning from. Olson had followed the men in. He stood near the door where the darkness was slightly less complete and watched. He watched the positioning of her hands. He watched the absence of hesitation. He watched the way she spoke to Greer, throughout steady, quiet, informative. Not the way someone speaks to calm a person down, but the way someone speaks who knows that information is itself a form of stability. When it was done, Olson stepped out without speaking. He walked to the eastern wall of the FOB and stood there looking out into the dark. He had known a few people like her in his career, not many. The specific qualities she had, the kind of competence so deep, it has stopped being something performed and become simply something present. He recognized it the way you recognize a dialect you grew up around but have not heard in a long time. It told him things. He was not yet sure what to do with what it told him. He would watch. He had learned that watching was almost always more useful than speaking. The fourth day was a Thursday. Thursdays at FOB Kestrel were by informal tradition the days the team ran range qualification and live fire refreshers. The mountains to the east provided natural sound dampening beyond 600 meters, making the range practical, without advertising the FOB's position to anyone on the ridgelines paying attention. Maya was not scheduled for the range. She walked there anyway. She told herself it was a perimeter check. She told herself she was cataloging sight lines from a medical positioning standpoint, identifying locations where casualties might need to be reached quickly. This was true. She was doing all of those things. But it was not the complete truth, and she had been in the habit of honesty with herself long enough that she acknowledged this quietly and kept walking. The range was occupied by 8 men running carbine drills at 200 and 400 meters. Mercer stood off to the side, observing the way commanders observe when assessing readiness. Briggs was running the session with the energy of someone who finds this kind of work genuinely satisfying. Marsh was at the 300-meter line, working through positional shots with an expression of profound concentration that suggested he was not confident in the results. At the 400-meter target, Marsh settled into prone, made his adjustments, and fired. The round hit the outer ring. He was off by approximately 18 inches. He knew it. Maya, standing 60 feet away, looked at the wind flags placed at 200 and 300 meters. She looked at the angle of the flags. She looked at Marsh's position. She looked at the target. She ran the calculation the way she had run thousands of calculations without effort, without ceremony, with the automatic reliability of a function so deeply learned it no longer requires conscious activation. The wind was coming from roughly 9 o'clock relative to Marsh's position. He had not corrected for it. The correction needed was approximately 2 clicks and a 4-inch hold off to the right. She said it before she realized she was saying it. Wind from 9 o'clock. 2 clicks up. Hold 4 right. She said it at normal conversational volume, not directed at anyone in particular, the way you say something you are thinking rather than something you intend to communicate. But in the partial quiet between shots, several people heard it. Marsh heard it. He looked over his shoulder at her with an expression somewhere between confused and curious. Then, with the practical instinct of someone who will try anything if his alternative is another miss at 400 meters, he made the adjustment. He fired. The round hit center mass. The range went slightly quiet in the way that ranges go quiet when something unexpected has occurred and people are deciding how to process it. Briggs was looking at her. His expression was not the easy dismissal of the first day. It was something more uncertain, the expression of a man whose original calculation has been complicated by new data and who is not yet sure what the new calculation should look like. Mercer, from his position off to the side, had heard. He looked at Maya for 3 seconds. Then he looked back at the range. Later, after the session had ended and the range cleared, Maya walked through the rifle station alone on her way back from the northern perimeter. She was not planning to stop. She had not given herself permission to stop. The M24 SWS was in its rack on the western wall. She saw it the way you see something you have been trying not to look at and have finally in an unguarded moment looked at anyway. She stopped walking. She stood there in the quiet of the empty station at a distance of approximately 8 feet from the rifle and looked at it. Not with want, exactly. With the complicated recognition of someone for whom a thing is both deeply familiar and deeply off limits. Like a door to a room in a house where you grew up, a room that has been closed for years for reasons decided by grief and love in approximately equal measure. She had been 10 years old the first morning her father set a rifle in front of her on a bench at the back of their property in Laredo. He had not been a man who wasted words on preamble. He placed it there and looked at her. "Before you touch it, tell me what it is." "It's a rifle," she had said, "a .308. He had looked at her with the expression of a patient man who is also a precise man. "Tell me what it is." She had thought about it. She was 10, but she had been listening to him since she was old enough to listen, and she understood already that her father did not ask small questions. "It's a tool," she said eventually. "It does what the person holding it decides to do." He nodded. "And what does that make the person holding it responsible?" He smiled. He did not smile frequently. When he did, she kept the memory of it the way you keep things that might need to last a long time. They shot every weekend for 6 years. Through Texas summers that turned the air into something you waded through rather than breathed. Through the year, her mother got sick and then got better. Through the year, he deployed to Iraq for the second time and came back thinner and quieter and more careful with everything he said. Until she was 16 and he was gone again, this time to Afghanistan, and then one November morning in 2011, a Marine in dress blues came to their house in Laredo, and after that there were no more weekends. Her mother had asked only one thing. In the weeks after in the house that had become full of silences, that used to be full of her father, her mother looked at her and said with a quietness that was itself a form of devastation, "Promise me you won't." She had promised, because it was what her mother needed, because grief asks for things and love provides them. Because she was 16 years old and the man who had taught her to be steady was gone, and being steady was the only thing left she knew how to do for the people still there. 8 years. She had kept that promise for 8 years. Her finger moved. It was not a conscious decision. It was the movement of a hand that had made this particular motion thousands of times, reaching for something that had spent years occupying the space where that motion expected something to be. Pure muscle memory. The oldest kind of knowing, the kind your body maintains independent of what your mind has decided. She caught herself, pulled her hand back, let her arm fall to her side. She turned and walked out of the station without looking back. But she had not been alone. Wade Olson had come in from the far end of the structure, silent in the way of men who have spent careers learning to move quietly there to check on equipment that needed a part ordered. He had seen her stop. He had seen her look at the rifle. He had seen the movement of her hand and the moment it arrested and the deliberate quality of the way she turned and left. He stood in the empty station after she was gone. He looked at the M24 in its rack. He looked at the doorway she had walked through. He had a picture now that he hadn't had before. It wasn't complete. There were gaps, shapes he could not yet define. But the outline was becoming visible the way outlines do when enough pieces have assembled themselves in the same space. He did not say anything to anyone that evening, but something in him had made a decision he had not yet put into words. Outside the mountains held the last of the day's light for a few minutes longer than anything below them did. The ridgelines burned orange and then faded to gray and then to the deep darkness of a sky with no competition from electricity for miles in any direction. Maya sat in the medical station and ran through her inventory one more time. She was thorough. She was quiet. She did not look toward the western wall, but her hands resting on the edge of the supply table were absolutely still. Steady, the way her father had taught them to be. Steady in the way that things are steady when they have been tested often enough that steadiness has stopped being an effort and become simply the default condition of being. In 2 days, those hands would be asked to do something she had promised herself they would never do again. She didn't know that yet. But somewhere in the part of her that had grown up on a bench behind a house in Laredo, learning to calculate wind and distance and the particular patience required to make a thing happen at 600 meters that most people could not make happen at 60, that part of her had already begun quietly without her permission to prepare. The mission brief came on the fourth evening. Captain Doyle Mercer stood at the front of the operations room With the economy of movement of someone who has delivered briefings in enough tight spaces that unnecessary motion has been eliminated from the process entirely. The room held 11 people. Maya was not one of them. She stood outside in the narrow corridor between the ops center and the adjacent structure, close enough to hear through the canvas partition without having been invited. She told herself she was there for medical planning purposes. Knowing the route, the timing, the likely contact zones, all of it was relevant to how she would pre-position the supplies, what she would pack, where she would need to be. This was true. It was also not the only reason she was standing in that corridor at that particular hour. The compound was in the northern valley, 14 kilometers out. Intel had identified it as a transit point for a high-value target moving weapons components through the Kunar corridor. The approach would be conducted at night on foot for the final 4 kilometers with helicopter support staged at a forward holding point 6 kilometers east. The timeline was tight. The terrain was unforgiving. The extraction window was 20 minutes from the moment of entry. Mercer's voice through the canvas was flat and precise. He gave the route. He gave the contingencies. He gave the communications plan and the abort criteria and the casualty collection point locations. He spoke for 11 minutes without repeating himself. When it was done, the men filed out. Mercer came last. He found Maya in the corridor. He looked at her for a moment. "You'll be with Chalk 2 on the approach. Primary casualty collection at the grid, I'll give you separately. You stay with the Chalk unless I tell you otherwise." She nodded. He started to move past her. Then he stopped. "Reeves, make sure your kit is built for a contact scenario, not a training day." He walked away. Maya went to the medical station and began building her kit. The night of the mission was designed by something deliberate, moonless wind, moving at a consistent 12 miles per hour from the northwest, temperature at 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The men moved through the cold with the flat efficiency of people who have long since stopped negotiating with physical discomfort and simply coexist with it. Maya moved with them. She had packed the ruck herself as always. Every item in its place, every contingency accounted for. The weight across her back was familiar in the way of things that have been carried long enough that their absence would feel stranger than their presence. She breathed through the first kilometer and settled into the pace, and after that her body found its rhythm, and the ruck became part of her the way it always did, not something additional, just something present. Chalk 2 was 8 men plus Maya. Olson ran the Chalk, moving at the front with the quiet authority of a man who has navigated terrain like this often enough that he no longer has to think about where to put his feet. Marsh was 3 positions back, young enough to find the darkness mildly exciting, experienced enough to know he should not show it. Briggs was at the rear, close enough to respond immediately, far enough back to see the entire formation at once. They made the approach in 53 minutes. No contact. The kind of movement that feels almost tedious right up until it is not. The compound appeared out of the dark the way compounds do in this part of the world, a collection of mud brick walls that the darkness made ambiguous until you were close enough for the details to resolve. 3 structures, a central courtyard, a gate on the southern wall that had been reinforced recently, the mortar fresher than the surrounding material. 2 members of the team noticed this. Maya, coming up behind them, also noticed without being asked. The strike team entered on Mercer's signal. It was clean for the first 4 minutes. Then the shot came from the western ridgeline. A single crack, the flat report of a high-powered rifle at distance, and Lance Corporal Greer went down in the courtyard. Not killed. Hit in the right thigh, the round passing through the outer tissue and missing the femoral artery by a margin that was either luck or providence, depending on what a person believed about those things. But down, bleeding. Out of the fight. Maya was moving before the second crack sounded. The second round hit the courtyard wall 3 inches from where Mercer's head had been when he moved. Someone had eyes on the courtyard. Someone on the high ground to the west with a rifle and the patience to wait for exactly this moment. The team went to cover. Mercer's voice came over the radio, controlled and clipped, calling the grid of the muzzle flash. "Western Ridge, approximately 750 meters, one shooter confirmed." In the follow-on silence, the seconds-long pause between a situation developing and a situation demanding a response. Several things were true simultaneously. Chief Breck Sutton, the element's designated marksman who carried the Barrett M82A1, was positioned on the eastern side of the compound outside the direct line to the western ridge, partially behind a wall that was structural cover but not firing position cover. Getting him to a viable position on the western wall would take time they did not have. The shooter on the ridge had already demonstrated both accuracy and patience. Sutton was also in this moment, approximately 4 seconds away from understanding that his right shoulder, which had taken the edge of a ricochet during the initial exchange, was not going to cooperate with the requirements of holding a 30-pound rifle at the correct angle for a 750-meter precision shot. The shoulder had been hit before repaired imperfectly and was now delivering a specific kind of pain that told anyone familiar with joint trauma exactly what was happening inside it. He knew before anyone told him. He lowered the rifle and looked at his right arm with the expression of a man assessing a problem rather than experiencing emotion about it. He looked across the courtyard. Through the darkness, he found Mercer. Mercer looked back at him. There was a silence of perhaps 2 seconds. Then Mercer turned his head. He did not look at his team. He looked at Maya Reeves crouched against the northern wall, both hands pressed against the tourniquet she had just cinched on Greer's thigh, Greer stable and conscious, the immediate crisis managed. Mercer did not say anything. He simply looked at her in the specific way of a commander who has run through his options and arrived at one he had not predicted. Maya finished the knot on the tourniquet. She checked Greer's eyes. She told him to keep his weight off the leg and stay low, and she would be back. Then she stood up. She crossed to Sutton. She looked at his shoulder. She looked at the Barrett M82A1 on the ground beside him. She picked it up. The rifle weighed 29 pounds unloaded. It was 23 inches longer than the M24 she had shot as a teenager. The 50 caliber BMG round it fired was a different category of physics from anything she had trained, on more energy, more recoil, more demand on the body behind it. Her father had shot a Barrett twice and had come home from the range on those evenings moving slightly differently from usual, carrying the experience in his body the way you carry something that demands to be respected. She got into position on the western wall behind a section of parapet that gave her a firing rest and the necessary elevation angle. She settled the bipod. She found the scope. 750 meters. The ridge was visible as an elevation line against the slightly lighter gray of the sky. The shooter's position was a darker irregularity in the natural contour of the rock, a gap between two limestone formations where a person with patience could lie completely still and have a clear line on the compound below. She found the gap. She ran the calculation. Wind at 12 from the northwest. Temperature 41. Elevation differential approximately 200 feet. The bullet would drop. The wind would push it left. She built the adjustments into the hold. She breathed in. The first shot missed. The wind shifted in the 3 seconds between when she had read it and when the round reached 750 meters. Not a dramatic shift. 4 miles per hour. But at that distance, 4 miles per hour is the difference between where you aimed and where the round went, and they are not the same place. From across the courtyard, Briggs said something. Not loud. The comment of a man whose prior expectation is being confirmed. She heard it. She filed it without reaction. She read the wind again. She thought about the approach march, about how the wind had felt against the left side of her face for the last kilometer, about the way the dust had moved off the courtyard walls when the firefight started. She made an adjustment that lived entirely in the calculation she was holding in her head and the degree to which she altered her hold point in the scope. She breathed in, let half of it out. She felt her heart rate the way she had been taught to feel it, not as something to fight, but as something to work with, to find the space between beats where the body is briefly completely still. She found that space. She fired. On the western ridge at 752 meters, the shooter did not fire again. The compound went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. There is a quality to silence that follows a threat being removed that is distinct from every other kind of silence, and everyone in that courtyard who had been in enough firefights to recognize it felt it at the same moment. Maya lowered the rifle. She set it down. She stood up, crossed back to Greer, knelt beside him, and checked his tourniquet. His eyes looking up at her were complicated in a way that would have required a long time to fully describe. She said nothing to him. She checked the wound, confirmed the tourniquet was seated correctly, and began preparing him for movement. Behind her, 11 men were processing what they had just seen in 11 different ways. Some of those ways were loud internally. Some were quiet, and all of them involved a significant revision of something. Briggs was standing near the eastern wall. He was not moving. He was looking at the western parapet where she had been positioned, and his face was doing something that his face, in all the time anyone at FOB Kestrel had known him, had not previously done. Something in the vicinity of recalibration, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind you can only see if you know what to look for. Olsen knew what to look for. He found it. He said nothing. They extracted without further contact. The entire return march happened in near total silence. Not the tactical silence of men maintaining noise discipline, the different silence of people who are thinking. In the days that followed, no one spoke to Maya directly about the shot, but conversations happened. Briggs found Olson at the vehicle maintenance bay the morning after they returned. He sat down. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone building towards something. 7:50, Briggs said, wind shift mid-flight. She recalculated and fired in under 4 seconds. Olson was working a wrench on a fitting that didn't particularly need working on. First shot missed, Briggs said. Olson set down the wrench. She didn't flinch, Briggs said. Most people, first shot goes wide, there's a moment. She just read the wind again and shot. Olson looked at him. Where do you learn that? Briggs said. Not the mechanics. The composure. Olson picked up the wrench again. Same place you learn anything real, he said. From someone who already had it. Briggs sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up and walked away without asking the follow-up question. He had been in the Marine Corps long enough to recognize when an answer had already been given. Mercer pulled her file again. He read it more carefully this time, with the focused attention of a man looking for something he suspects is there, but has not yet found. The file was clean in the way that told him what was absent more clearly than what was present. Qualified marksman, M16 and M4, score 98 of 100. No sniper qualification, no assigned marksmanship designation. Nothing in the training record that would account for a 750-meter shot under combat conditions with a weapon she had not been certified on. He set the file down. He did not reach a conclusion. He acknowledged that he did not have enough information to reach one. Marsh asked her directly. He had never been the kind of person who found indirection efficient. He found her in the medical station on the second morning after the mission doing inventory in the way she always did, methodically without haste, each item verified and replaced in its position. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat on the edge of the supply table. Where did you learn to shoot like that? She continued the inventory. My father taught me. He waited to see if there was more. Who was he? She closed the supply box. She looked at Marsh for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much of a true thing to say. He was a Marine, she said. He's gone now. Marsh nodded. He had the instinct at 21 to ask the next question. He also had enough situational awareness to recognize that the question had already been answered in the quality of the silence that followed, and that asking it out loud would be adding noise where it wasn't wanted. He got up and left. It was Chief Breck Sutton who asked the question she had not been expecting. He had been in the medical station for 2 days by then. His shoulder stabilized through the first critical night, the joint managing better than the first assessment had suggested it would, though not well enough for operational duties. He was a patient, the way experienced operators usually are, cooperative, uncomplaining, deeply bored, and possessed of an attention to his immediate environment that even convalescence did not diminish. Maya had been checking his shoulder twice daily. The routine had established a quiet between them, not the awkward silence of strangers, but the functional quiet of people comfortable enough not to require constant verbal maintenance. He watched her work. She worked. Occasionally he made a dry observation about something, and she replied with a short precision that in a restrained way came close to being funny. On the second morning he said something that was not a dry observation. Thomas Reeves was your father. She was wrapping the shoulder. Her hands did not stop. How did you know that? He let a moment pass. The way you shoot, the way you read wind, the way you were positioned on that parapet. There's a specific technique in the way you set the bipod and build the natural point of aim that I've only seen one other person use. He called it loading the position. I never saw anyone else call it that until I watched you do it. She finished the wrap. She secured the edge of the bandage. She set both hands in her lap. Tell me, she said. Her voice was level, completely level. The voice of a person who has decided they are ready to hear something and has made the internal preparations necessary to hear it without coming apart. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the wall. In honesty, she recognized the act of looking at a wall when saying something difficult, carrying the weight of it, without performing the grief. Helmand Province, he said, November 2011, I was running with a joint element out of Camp Leatherneck. Your father's force recon unit was part of the same task force. We had a rote. Intel was supposed to be solid. He paused. It wasn't solid. The story he told her took 12 minutes. He told it without embellishment because he was the kind of man who had learned that the truth in its plain form already contains everything embellishment tries to add. He told her about the canyon's approach, the narrow defile between two ridges where the moment they entered it, the geometry was wrong in a way that someone with experience would feel before they could explain it. Her father had stopped the column, one hand raised flat, definitive, the hand of a man who has made a decision. He turned to Sutton at the rear of the formation and used the hand signal for abort. Then he used the hand signal for something else, the signal that means go, just go. The ambush initiated 30 seconds after Sutton's position cleared the southern end of the defile. He had heard it from 200 meters back. He had heard the volume of fire and understood with the understanding of a man who has been in enough firefights to read them like text, that what was happening in that canyon could not be survived by the person absorbing it so that everyone else could be somewhere else. 7 men got out, he said. Your father was not one of them. He looked at her directly. I tried to go back. 2 of us tried. They pulled us out. We tried again at first light with a full QRF. There was nothing left to go back to. Maya was looking at her own hands in her lap. She was not crying. She was doing the thing she had learned to do with very large things, holding them in both hands, without dropping them and without pretending they were smaller than they were. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, before we went out that night, he told me something. He said, if this goes the way I think it might go, find my daughter and tell her I knew what I was doing. Tell her it was a choice I made with clear eyes. Tell her that. He paused. I tried to find you. Twice. Both times the contact information in his file was outdated. His unit records were in processing, then sealed, then in a review cycle. I filed a request with Casualty Affairs in 2014 and again in 2016. Both times I got acknowledgement letters and nothing else. He looked at her. When I heard your name on the assignment manifest, I thought I had misread it. Then I saw you on the range. Then I saw you on that parapet with the Barrett. And I knew I hadn't misread anything. The medical station was quiet in the way of small rooms when significant things had been said inside them. Maya sat with what he had given her, not trying to rearrange it, not trying to make it smaller or larger than it was, just holding it. She said he knew it was a setup, Sutton. He knew it was possible. The geometry of that canyon was wrong enough that he made the call he made. She said he chose to absorb it. Sutton looked at her steadily. He chose, he said, to make sure the rest of us didn't have to. She nodded slowly. The nod of a person not agreeing with something, but acknowledging the weight of it. The nod of a daughter who has spent 8 years building a version of her father's death inside her head, a version containing all the information she had been given, which was not enough, and none of the information she was hearing now, which was what had been missing, and is revising that version in real time. She stood up. She was steadier than he expected. Than most people would have been. She said, you've been looking for me for 8 years. He said, your father asked me to find you. That made it an obligation. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in her face that was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was the expression of a person who has spent a long time carrying a weight they didn't know how to name and has just been told the name. She put her hand on the top of the supply cabinet, just for a moment. Then she took it away. I need to run my inventory checks, she said. I'll be back this evening for the shoulder. He nodded. She walked out of the medical station and across the compound and through the gate in the eastern wall to the narrow open ground between the perimeter and the maintenance sheds. She stood there for a while. The morning air was cool and carried dust and the distant smell of the valley. The ridgeline stood above everything in the permanent way of ridgelines. She thought about a morning in Laredo when she was 12 years old and her father had made her lie in prone position for 20 minutes without firing, just breathing, just learning what it felt like to be still. She had asked him why. He said because the stillness has to come before anything else. You can't build accuracy on movement. You build accuracy on stillness, and then movement comes after. She had been still for 8 years. The second confirmation of what she was came 2 nights later. New intelligence had identified a position on the eastern approach corridor where a Taliban marksman had been placed to monitor FOB movement. The position was a natural feature, a shelf of rock at approximately 1,100 meters that provided a clear line of sight to the primary exit route while remaining nearly invisible from ground level. He had been patient and professional. He had not fired frequently. But twice in the preceding week, movement outside the wire had drawn rounds close enough to enforce a particular kind of caution on anyone needing to leave through that corridor. The situation was straightforward in its problem and complicated in its solution. 1,100 meters was not a distance that rewarded anything less than genuine precision. The conditions that evening, wind gusting to 18 miles per hour from the northwest, ambient temperature dropping light, flat, and directionless under an overcast sky, made genuine precision a requirement rather than an aspiration. Mercer found Maya in the medical station. He told her what the situation was and what the range was and what the conditions were. Then he waited. She said, I'll need 10 minutes to set up. He nodded and left. She packed her kit and then crossed to the rifle station and took the Barrett from its rack. She handled it without ceremony. The weight was familiar now, familiar in the way of a thing you have made peace with rather than a thing you have always loved. She carried it to the northern parapet and spent 8 of her 10 minutes simply reading the environment. The wind, the way dust moved at 200 meters, and the way it moved at 500. The temperature against her exposed skin. The light. At 1100 meters, the rock shelf was visible as a faint irregularity in the terrain. A shape the landscape had not intended, but that a person with knowledge of how people use landscape had known to look for. She found it in the scope. She held the position for 90 seconds without firing, building the calculation, checking it, building it again. The wind gusted. She waited. It settled to a baseline. She fired. One round, 1100 meters. The rock shelf produced no further complications that evening or in the days that followed. Mercer was standing 15 feet behind her when she fired. He watched the shot. He watched her lower the rifle and begin breaking down her position with the same economy of motion she brought to everything. He stood there for a moment after she had shouldered the rifle and turned. He said, "Your father," she looked at him. He said, "Force Recon?" She said, "First Marines, 3 deployments." He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Something moved through his expression that was careful and honest and carried in it what he would have called respect if he had been in the habit of naming things directly. He was not, but it was respect. He knew what it was. He said, "Thank you, Corpsman Reeves." She said, "Sir." She walked back toward the medical station. Behind her, Mercer stood for a moment longer at the northern parapet, looking out at the 1100-meter ridgeline in the settling dark. Later in the quiet of the medical station, she sat with her back against the supply cabinet and held her father's absence in both hands, the way he had taught her to hold the rifle firmly, but without force, with the patience that allows the target to come to you, rather than you lunging after it. She thought about what Sutton had told her. She thought about the canyon in Helmand in November 2011, and the geometry that was wrong, and the hand raised flat in the signal for stop, and the other hand making the different signal, the older signal that was simply go. Just go. She thought about a man who had calculated the cost of a decision and made the decision anyway, and who had somehow in the middle of making it found a moment to leave a message for a 16-year-old girl in Laredo, Texas, who would not receive it for 8 years. The medical station was quiet around her. Outside, the FOB held its night routines. Somewhere on the perimeter, footsteps crossed the gravel at the steady pace of a patrol that would cover the same ground again in 20 minutes. She closed her eyes. She breathed in. She breathed out. In 2 days, she would need to be both things at once, the medic and the shooter, the hands that heal and the hands that stop what is doing the harming. The part of her that had spent years learning to be ready for things before they arrived was already making the preparations the rest of her had not yet been asked to make. The mountains outside held their positions in the dark. The night settled over the valley and the ridgelines above it. Maya Reeves sat in the quiet and was still. The order came on the 6th night. Mercer delivered it at 1800 hours with the deliberate calm of a man who has learned that the quality of a briefing is inversely related to the amount of urgency its speaker allows into his voice. The mission was the largest the FOB had mounted in 3 months. 3 chalks, 31 personnel. The objective was a compound complex 4 kilometers north of the previous target, deeper into the valley where intelligence had confirmed the presence of the high-value individual they had been building toward for 2 weeks. The window was narrow. The terrain was the kind that has absorbed a generation of fighting and been shaped by that absorption into something that favors neither side and punishes both. 3 approach routes, 2 extraction points, a 20-minute window from compound breach to wheels up, and no flexibility in that number. Maya sat through the briefing in the back of the room. This time she had been given a chair. She listened to everything. She looked at the topographic map and marked in the part of her mind that had been doing this since her father first taught her to read terrain from the elevated ground of a Texas hillside, the locations where casualties would be most likely and what would be required to reach them. She noted the drainage ditch along the eastern approach that would provide cover for a casualty drag. She noted the open ground in front of the northern compound wall that provided none. After the briefing, she went to the medical station and built her kit for the last time. She was not superstitious about numbers, but she was attentive to the quality of her own attention, and on this evening her attention had been sharpened to the degree where further sharpening would damage it. Everything she needed was in its place. Everything she did not need was absent. The kit weighed 41 pounds. She picked up the photograph she kept in the interior pocket of her blouse. She did not take it out. She felt the shape of it through the fabric. Then she finished packing and went to sleep. They stepped off at 2100. The night was cold and clear and deeply dark. No moon, no cloud cover, no artificial light within 10 kilometers. The stars above the Kunar Valley were extravagant, the kind of sky that only exists in places far from the light pollution of the world that has electricity in sufficient quantity to waste it. On another occasion, a person might have stopped to appreciate this. No one stopped. Maya moved with Chalk 2 in the middle of the formation. Olson at the front. Marsh 3 positions back carrying the extra medical kit she had handed him before they stepped off, no explanation given. Briggs at the rear. She felt the ground through her boots the way she had learned to feel it, reading the texture and angle and stability of each step, making the micro-adjustments that keep a person upright in rocky terrain at night without breaking noise discipline. The approach took 58 minutes. No contact. The compound resolved out of the dark at approximately 100 hours, and the 3 chalks separated into their designated approach vectors with the wordless efficiency of people whose bodies have rehearsed the separation enough times to perform it while their minds are occupied elsewhere. The first 4 minutes were clean. The IED was buried under the northern approach path, approximately 30 meters from the compound wall. It had been placed with patience and professional knowledge of where a force approaching from the south would direct its lead element. The trigger was pressure activated. The 4th man's left boot found it at 0104. The explosion was not the largest Maya had heard. It was also not the smallest. It compressed the air in the way that high-order explosive compresses air, a physical event you feel before you hear a pressure wave that moves through the body faster than the mind can process what is producing it. The night fractured into noise and dust in the particular chaos that follows any event that eliminates all prior assumptions about how the next 60 seconds will unfold. Maya was moving before the dust had fully resolved. The 2 nearest casualties from Chalk 1 were 12 meters ahead of her position. She covered the distance at a run low using the compound wall's shadow for what cover it offered. The first man was sitting upright, conscious, his left hand holding his right forearm in a way that told her the arm was broken, but the bleeding was controlled. She told him to stay low and stay still, and she would come back. She moved to the second man. He was on his back. The blast had taken him from the left side. His left leg was the immediate problem. The femoral artery sits deep in the thigh, deep enough that most wounds do not reach it close enough to the surface, that when something does, the consequences are measured in 90-second intervals. She could see the arterial bleed from 2 meters away, the specific dark pulsing quality of it in the ambient starlight. She was beside him in one movement. Alderman, stay with me. She had her tourniquet out and was applying it 4 inches above the wound in the 3 seconds it took her to process the location and severity. The cat tourniquet cinched. She tightened it until the bleeding changed from arterial pulse to something that could be managed. She marked the time on the tourniquet with the marker clipped to her chest strap. She looked at his face. He was still with her. Stay on the ground, she said. Don't move the leg. I will be back. She moved. The second casualty was against the compound's northern wall, sitting forward at an angle that told her something had happened to his chest before she had crossed the 5 meters between them. Fragment entry right side below the clavicle. Not arterial, but the wound was open and needed sealing before movement. She pressed the combat gauze in with her right hand and held it there while she talked to him in the flat, steady voice she kept for exactly these moments. Not the voice of comfort, but the voice of information, because men under fire respond to information better than they respond to comfort, because information tells them someone in the darkness has a plan. She held the seal until his breathing changed from labored to something that could sustain him to the next stage of treatment. She marked him yellow. She moved. Chalk 3 had breached the eastern wall and was pushing through the compound interior. Radio traffic told her the primary target had been confirmed inside the northern structure. The timeline was moving. Then the second sniper opened up. The position was the eastern ridgeline above and behind Chalk 3's approach. The range was significant, 1,400 meters at minimum, possibly further. The first round hit the compound wall 6 inches above the head of the Chalk 3 commander. It was either an adjustment shot or a warning, and in either case it functioned as the same thing, a message that the eastern ridgeline belonged to someone who was going to make the extraction timeline very difficult. Chalk 3 went flat. 8 men against the eastern compound wall. Unable to advance without presenting themselves to a shooter they could not see at a distance, they could not effectively return fire across. Maya heard the report. She processed it in the 2 seconds she had between finishing her work on the chest casualty and moving toward the next. She turned her head and found Olson. He was already looking at her. She said nothing to him. She looked at the Barrett M82A1 that had been brought on this operation and now sat on the ground 12 feet away, its carrier redirected to a position on the southern wall that did not intersect with a 1,400-meter firing line to the east. She said to Olson, "Stay with him. Keep both hands on the dressing and don't change the pressure." She placed his hands on the dressing she had applied. She felt him take the pressure. Then she stood up and crossed to the Barrett. 1,400 meters. She had not fired at 1,400 meters. It was a distance that existed in the upper range of what was physically possible with this platform under ideal conditions, and the conditions on this night in this valley were not ideal. Wind variable. Temperature dropped 4 degrees since they had stepped off. Light insufficient for the kind of optical clarity that makes long-range precision straightforward. None of this changed anything. She found the parapet of the eastern compound wall the only elevated firing position providing a line to the eastern ridge. She settled the bipod. She found the scope. She began reading. 1,400 meters of atmosphere is a significant quantity of atmosphere. The wind at the shooter's position is not the wind at the target's position, and the wind in between is not necessarily either of those things. She had been taught this by a man who had found it out through practice rather than theory, and he had conveyed it the way he conveyed everything important directly without mystification, with the implicit message that understanding a difficulty is the first step toward not being defeated by it. She read the near wind from dust movement at 200 meters. She read the mid-range wind from vegetation on the valley floor where it was visible. She read the far wind from the way the ridgeline's loose surface materials caught the starlight at irregular intervals. She assembled these 3 readings into a single calculation that was not entirely precise and could not be entirely precise and was as close to correct as the available information allowed. She breathed. She fired. 1,411 meters away on a limestone shelf above the eastern approach quarter, the firing position stopped producing fire. Chalk 3 began to move. Maya lowered the rifle. She set it down, stood, and went back to Olson and the man they were both working to keep alive. She was halfway back across the open ground when the muzzle flash appeared from the rooftop of the western structure inside the compound, a position that had not been cleared that no one had anticipated being occupied 12 meters from her current location with a clear line to everything in the central courtyard. The round hit her. She understood within the first second of understanding that she had been hit because she triaged herself the way she triaged everyone else, without sentiment, without panic, with the flat, honest assessment of what was present and what it meant. The fragment had entered her left shoulder from a lateral angle driven by a near miss that had partially detonated against the parapet behind her rather than finding a direct path. It was in the tissue. It had not hit bone. It had not hit the subclavian artery, which she knew because she was still upright, and her blood pressure was still providing her with functional consciousness. It hurt in the specific way of things that the body registers as damage, but that the body's emergency systems override in favor of continued operation. She had heard this described before. She had treated people in this condition before. She had not until this moment been in this condition herself. She kept moving. In the space between the western structure and Olson's position, in the 2 seconds it took her to cross that ground, she extracted the hemostatic gauze from her outer chest pocket, the pocket she had placed it in specifically because it was accessible with either hand, and pressed it against her left shoulder with her right hand. She pushed it in. The pain elevated sharply and then plateaued at the level where the body's chemistry makes decisions about what to do with information of this kind. She tied the gauze in place using a length of self-adhesive bandage she had positioned for one-handed access. She bit down on the end to hold it while her right hand made the wrap. She pulled it tight with her teeth and her right hand simultaneously. 41 seconds. She went back to work. Alderman first. She checked the tourniquet. The bleeding had been controlled. His color was poor but stable. She elevated the leg against a section of fallen wall and gave him the information he needed in the flat, steady voice. "You're going to be fine. The tourniquet is holding. Do not touch it. Do not move it. When the helicopter comes, tell them ACM2 Reeves applied it at 0107. He nodded. His eyes were clear enough. She moved. Corporal Briggs found her at the next casualty. He came across the courtyard at a low run with the energy of a man who has made a decision and is executing it before he can talk himself out of it. He dropped beside her without being asked and held the position she needed held while her hands worked. He saw the bandaging on her shoulder. She felt him see it. He started to say something. She said, "How many are left outside the wall?" He processed the redirect. "2," he said, "east side of the breach." She said, "When I'm done here, you go first and I follow." He nodded. Whatever he had been about to say about her shoulder went somewhere else and stayed there. They worked through the remaining casualties in a sequence that Maya would later be unable to remember with perfect clarity, not because it was unclear at the time, but because it was the kind of work that happens below the level of narrative, where the body has taken over from the mind and is executing what has been trained into it with a reliability that conscious thought would actually interfere with. She moved, she assessed, she treated, she moved again. Her shoulder delivered its consistent report, and she acknowledged it and continued. The radio told her the primary target had been secured. The radio told her the extraction helicopters were 12 minutes out. The radio told her things she processed and used and did not stop to feel anything about. Marsh appeared beside her at the next casualty. He had the extra kit she had given him before they stepped off. He had it open and was already reaching for the correct items in the correct order, in the way of someone who had been paying attention to how this was done since the first time he had seen it done. She did not tell him he was using the kit correctly. There was no time for that. But she noted it in the part of her that noted things, and she moved him to the left side of the casualty where his angle was better, and they worked together for 90 seconds in a silence that was entirely functional. The helicopters came in at 0149. The landing zone was the cleared ground south of the compound. The two aircraft settled into the dust with the commitment of pilots who have learned that hesitation in a hot zone costs more than speed. The rotors did not stop. The ramps came down. Maya moved alongside the flow of personnel toward the aircraft, not boarding but moving alongside, checking, assessing, clearing each person through with the cognitive inventory she had been running since 0104. The man with the broken arm, the man from Chalk 3, whose face wound was managed. Alderman carried by two men, tourniquet visible on his thigh, conscious, making eye contact with her as he passed. She checked him one more time as they loaded him. She looked at the tourniquet. She looked at his face. "Tell them 0107, she said. He said, "I know, you told me." She said, "Tell them again." The ramp went up. The aircraft lifted. The second helicopter received the remaining personnel. Briggs was the last man to the ramp. He turned at the top of it and looked back. She was standing in the clearing south of the compound in the rotor wash, the dust moving around her in the violent way of things being disturbed by forces larger than themselves. Her left arm was at an angle that was not quite right. The bandaging on her shoulder had darkened through. She was standing very still in the way of someone applying considerable internal resources to the act of standing. Marsh was beside her. "Doc," he said, "you need to get on the helicopter." She looked at the departing aircraft. She looked at the compound behind her. She ran the inventory one more time with the focused completeness that had been her operating mode for the past 47 minutes. She ran it the way her father had taught her to run every check, not quickly, not carelessly, not as a formality, but with the genuine intention of finding anything still present that needed her. She found nothing. Everyone was accounted for. Everyone who needed treatment had been treated. The compound was cleared. The intelligence objective had been achieved. The eastern ridgeline was no longer producing fire. Every casualty was on board or walking. She had run the inventory to its end. Then she stopped running it. Her left knee went first, then the right. She was aware of the ground coming toward her and of being unable to do anything useful about that fact. And then the ground was where she was, and Marsh was beside her and saying her name, and she was looking up at the Afghan sky with its extravagant stars and thinking in the specific way of a person whose body has finally presented its bill that this was a reasonable place to stop for a moment. Marsh's face appeared above her. She said, "Is everyone accounted for?" He said, "Yes, everyone." She said, "Good." Then the stars went away. She came back to consciousness in stages, the way consciousness returns when the body has borrowed deeply from its reserves and is repaying the loan in installments. First the ceiling, then the sound of the medical station's equipment, then the quality of light that comes from LED strips positioned along the canvas ridge poles of a field medical facility. Then the IV line in the back of her right hand, the drip of the bag, the measured cadence of a monitor. Someone was beside her. She turned her head. The medic was young. He had the expression of someone who has been sitting with a responsibility for several hours and is experiencing significant relief at its reduction. He said, "Don't move yet. You've been out for 6 hours." She took this information in. She processed it the way she processed information with implications, not dismissing it, not panicking, simply incorporating it into the current picture and assessing what the current picture required. What it required was for her to be upright. She sat up. Her left shoulder communicated its situation with considerable specificity. She acknowledged the communication and swung her legs off the cot. The medic stood. He began to say something about the fragment still being present, in the surgeon's recommendation, in the follow-up imaging that had been scheduled, in the considerable inadvisability of what she was currently doing. She put her feet on the ground. She stood up. The world adjusted itself briefly and then settled into its correct orientation. She breathed in. She breathed out. She found her footing. She walked toward the entrance of the medical station. She pushed back the canvas flap and stepped out into the morning light. What she saw stopped her where she stood. FOB Kestrel, in the early morning, had a quality of light she had noticed before. The particular way the sun coming over the eastern ridgeline at low angles struck the pale dust of the compound floor and turned it briefly golden before the day advanced far enough to burn the gold away. She had noticed it before. She had never stood in it in quite this way. The compound was full of people, not in the way that FOBs are full of people going about the work of their day, full in the way a space becomes full when people have gathered deliberately with intention in a specific arrangement that has meaning. They were standing in lines, not parade formation. Nothing about the spacing or uniformity suggested an official drill. It was the arrangement of people who have chosen to be somewhere together and have chosen without being told to stand in a way that acknowledges the weight of the occasion. There were a great many of them: Marines in desert utilities, Navy personnel in operational working uniforms, SEAL operators in the mixed kit that Tier 1 personnel wear when not required to wear anything else, Rangers from the QRF element, support personnel, the mechanics, the cooks, the men who ran the communications equipment and maintained the vehicles and kept the FOB functioning in the thousand necessary ways that do not appear in any account of heroism, but without which heroism has nowhere to occur. They were all there. She did not know how many there were. Later, someone would tell her the number. At this moment, standing in the canvas doorway in a medical gown with an IV site taped to the back of her right hand and a bandaged shoulder, she did not count. She simply saw them, the scale of them, the stillness of them, and then beginning at the front of the formation and moving through it in the sequential way that things move through a crowd. When they begin at one point and travel without instruction, through the whole every hand came up. 500 people, in the morning light of the Kunar Valley, in silence. Every hand raised. She stood in the doorway and did not move. She had not understood until this moment what she had done. Not because she was unaware of the events of the previous night, she retained every detail of those 47 minutes with the precise clarity of experiences that occur when the brain's recording systems are operating at their highest capacity. She knew what she had done. She simply had not, until she saw 500 people standing in the morning light with their hands raised, understood what it had meant to the people who had been there beside her. Cole Briggs was in the front row. He was standing straight in a way that cost him something. His eyes were red in the way of eyes that have been red for a while. His hand was up with the precision of a man who has been performing this gesture for decades and knows exactly how it is supposed to be performed and is performing it now with everything he has. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the first morning and the comment about the wrong person on the wrong bird. She thought about the range and the expression on his face when she had read the wind without knowing she was saying it aloud. She thought about the courtyard and his hands beside hers at the next casualty, doing exactly what needed to be done without being asked. Cody Marsh was in the second row. He was not red-eyed. He was the specific color of a person who has moved through a long night into a morning and is standing in it with the intention of remembering everything about it for as long as he lives. His hand was up. When her eyes found him, he held her gaze with the steadiness of someone who has decided something about himself in the last 12 hours and is living in the first morning of that decision. She found Olson in the fourth row. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at her since the first day, with the careful attention of someone who has been watching for something and has found it. His hand was up. His expression was the expression of a man who is satisfied in the deep, quiet way that men who have seen a great deal are occasionally satisfied that the world has produced something worth the attention he gave it. She looked toward the medical station to her right at the window of the convalescence area. Breck Sutton was in the window. He was sitting up on the edge of his cot, his repaired shoulder wrapped, his right arm raised in the slow, deliberate way of someone for whom the gesture costs something physical and who is paying the cost without discussion. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about a canyon in Helmand in November 2011, and a man who had raised one hand in the signal for stop and then raised the other in the signal for go and then had not come home. She thought about 8 years of a promise. She thought about what the promise had cost and what it had given and what it had meant to keep it and what it had meant in the end to do the thing it had asked her not to do. Colonel Thad Hargrove stepped out of the formation. He was 56 years old and walked with the bearing of a man who has spent most of his adult life in uniform and has been shaped by that uniform into something that cannot be easily separated from it. He carried a box in both hands, the specific small box covered in dark navy cloth that anyone who has attended a military awards ceremony will recognize before the lid is opened because the size and the covering tell you before anything else what is inside. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment with the directness of a man who has done this before and knows it does not become easier with repetition and who is doing it now because it is correct and necessary and because correctness and necessity are what he has organized his life around. He said, HM2 Maya Reeves. By order of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, I am authorized to present the Navy Cross, awarded posthumously to Master Sergeant Thomas Allen Reeves, United States Marine Corps, for extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty in the face of enemy action. Helmand Province, Afghanistan, November 14, 2011. He paused. He said, this was approved 12 days after his death. It was placed in administrative hold due to a classification review that was not resolved in a timely manner. It remained in that hold for 8 years. That is a failure of this institution, and I acknowledge it as such. He held out the box. She took it with her right hand. The box was lighter than she expected. Important things often are. He said, there's something else. He reached into the inside pocket of his uniform blouse and produced an envelope. It was the kind of envelope that has been kept carefully for a long time. The paper had acquired the ivory quality of age, and the fold lines were sharp from years of being maintained in exactly the same configuration. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she recognized before she could have explained how she recognized it the way you recognize things learned before you had a vocabulary for how learning happens. He said Chief Sutton has been carrying this for 8 years. He asked me to present it. She took the envelope. She held both the box and the envelope for a moment. Then she opened the box. The Navy Cross lay on its dark lining. A gold cross patée with an eagle at the center suspended from a navy blue ribbon with a thin center stripe. It caught the morning light with the flat honesty of metal made with care. It was not ornate. It was not intended to be ornate. It was intended to mean something specific, and it did. She closed the box. She opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages handwritten, the lines straight in the way of someone who has a disciplined hand and uses it. The date in the upper right corner was November 13th, 2011. The evening before. She read it. She read Maya. If you are reading this, I did not come home. I want you to understand that I am writing this not because I believe I am not coming home, but because a man who is responsible for other people prepares for the things he does not want to believe. That is what responsibility requires. She read, I have been trying to think about what I want to tell you, and I keep arriving at the same few things. The first is that you should not spend your life being angry on my behalf. What I do with clear eyes. The cost of a decision is not a reason to refuse the decision. You know this. I taught you this. I taught you this because I believed it, and I believe it now, and I need you to believe it too. She read the second thing is about the shooting. I know your mother will ask you not to. I know you will agree because you love her, and because in grief love makes promises. That promise came from the right place. Keep it as long as it serves the right place it came from. But when it stops serving that place, when keeping the promise becomes about fear rather than love, I give you my permission to let it go. You were built for both. The hands that can heal are the same hands that can protect. One does not cancel the other. They were always meant to work together. She read the third thing as the simplest. I am proud of you in a way that I have not always known how to say out loud. You have always been braver than me. You just did not know it yet. She read heal when you can, fight when you must, and remember that steady does not mean unfeeling. It means you feel everything and you do what needs to be done anyway. That is the only kind of steady that matters. She read I love you. That is not past tense. Love does not observe tense. I love you in whatever form I am in when you read this. Do not forget that. She folded the letter. She placed it carefully into the front pocket of her medical gown over her sternum, where it would rest against her chest. She looked up. 500 hands were still raised. The morning light was still gold. The mountains stood above everything in the permanent way of mountains. She raised her right hand. In the front row, Briggs exhaled. It was barely audible. In the context of what surrounded it, it was the loudest thing in the compound. Marsh in the second row did not look away. He had decided to remember this, and he was remembering it. Sutton at the window held his arm up for another 3 seconds. Then he lowered it and sat back against the wall and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has carried something for 8 years and has just set it down in the right place. She stood in the morning light with her hand raised and her father's letter against her chest and his medal in her right hand and the Kunar Valley spread out below the ridgelines and 47 minutes of the previous night still in every muscle of her body. She stood in all of it, without collapsing, without performance, without anything other than the quality her father had spent 6 years teaching her on a bench behind a house in Laredo in Texas summers that turned the air into something you waded through rather than breathed. Steady, the kind that is not the absence of feeling, the kind that is feeling held in both hands and the work continuing anyway. 6 months later, March arrived at Camp Pendleton with the particular quality of California mornings in early spring, cool enough to be honest about the season, bright enough to suggest that honesty is temporary. The base was awake at 0530 in the way that military installations are always awake before the civilian world considers waking, and the building at the northern edge of the training complex had been lit since 0500 when Maya Reeves had arrived to set up for the day. She had set up the room the way she set up every space she was responsible for, with complete attention and complete intentionality. 18 chairs in 3 rows of 6, a whiteboard at the front. On the whiteboard, written in her even hand, heal when you can, fight when you must. Below that in smaller letters, the two are not in competition. The dark circles under her eyes had faded. They had been significant in the weeks after Kunar, the visible marking of a body that has spent more than it had and is slowly rebuilding the reserve. The color had come back in those weeks. She had gained back the weight she had lost, plus a pound, which was not something she had been tracking, but that her mother had noted with quiet satisfaction during a phone call in January. The fragment had been removed at Bagram 22 hours after the fob. The surgery was straightforward. The recovery had taken 3 months, not because the wound was severe, but because she had returned to physical training on a schedule that her surgeon described as aggressive and that she described as necessary. They had negotiated. She had done most of what he asked and supplemented the rest on her own time. She was not the same person who had arrived at FOB Kestrel in September. This was not a dramatic observation. She had not been transformed in the way of stories that require a person to become unrecognizable to themselves. She was recognizable. She was the same fundamental person, the same quality of stillness, the same economy of movement, the same preference for doing over explaining. But some of what had been locked inside that stillness had been opened, and the opening had not weakened it. It had given it more room. She stood at the whiteboard and looked at the 18 chairs. They began arriving at 0630. Young men and women in Navy working uniforms, some of them uncertain in the way of people who are new to a thing and not yet sure what the thing requires. Some had heard things about the instructor. The things they had heard varied in accuracy but were consistent in one respect. She was not someone who wasted your time, and she expected the same in return. She looked at them as they settled into the chairs. She looked at them the way she had learned to look at things that mattered, with the attention that is itself a form of respect. She picked up a marker. She pointed at the board. The first line she said means that your primary function in any situation is to preserve life. Every tool you have, every hour of training you have, every decision you make begins with that. If a person can be saved, you save them. Full stop. She moved to the second line. The second line means that the first line is not always sufficient. There are situations where the thing killing your people is still present and still acting, and the only way to protect the people you are responsible for is to stop the thing that is threatening them. In those situations, you do not set aside your role as a healer. You carry both roles simultaneously. The hands that can do this thing and the hands that can do that thing belong to the same person. They are not in conflict. They were always meant to work together. She paused. I am not going to tell you this is easy. It is not easy. It asks something of you that is uncomfortable to be asked. But I will tell you something my father told me when I was young. The discomfort of being asked to hold two difficult things at once is not a sign that you are doing it wrong. It is a sign that you understand the weight of what you are holding. She looked at the 18 faces looking back at her. He was right about that, she said. He was right about most things. She set the marker down. Let's start, she said. On the drive back across Camp Pendleton that evening, she pulled into the lot beside the training facility and took her phone out. She had a habit recently established of calling her mother on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It was Tuesday. Her mother answered on the second ring. They talked for 30 minutes about the classes. About the curriculum the Marine Corps was reviewing for potential expansion to 3 additional installations, which Maya mentioned without particular emphasis, and which her mother received with the particular emphasis that mothers apply to things their children mention without it. about the weather in California and the weather in Laredo, about the small domestic details of her mother's life that were the connective tissue of the relationship, and that Maya had learned over the past 6 months to value with a specificity she had not previously applied to them. Before they hung up, her mother said, "He would have liked to see this, what you are building." Maya looked out the windshield at the California evening. The light at this hour had a warmth different from the light of Kunar's softer, less ancient feeling, the light of a place that has not been a battlefield in living memory. She appreciated it. She had not always appreciated it. She said, "I know." Her mother said, "I think he already knows." She didn't answer that. There were things she had decided to hold without converting them into language, and this was one of them. She held it the way her father had taught her to hold the rifle firmly, steadily, without force. She said goodnight. She put the phone away. She sat in the quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and touched the envelope that was always there now. Its ivory paper familiar under her fingers, its fold lines sharp from years of careful keeping by a man who had believed in honoring what he had been asked to carry. She did not take it out. She had read it enough times that it was inside her in the way things become inside you when you have carried them long enough with enough attention. She simply acknowledged it, the way you acknowledge the presence of something that matters. On her phone, one new email. SOCOM, Monday, 800. Bring kit. She read it twice. She put the phone in her jacket pocket. She started the car. The road back ran along the perimeter of the training fields, where tomorrow morning 18 people would sit in 18 chairs and she would stand at the front and give them the things that had been given to her by the man who had understood from the beginning that a person built right is not built for one thing. The California evening moved past the windows. The light faded by degrees into the deep blue of the hour before full dark, and the first stars appeared above the Pacific, and she drove through the quiet with both hands on the wheel and the road ahead long and clear. Steady, both hands, ready.